We interrupt this service to bring you this breaking news. Good morning. A shocking incident occurred today here in Norwalk, Connecticut, when a group of people entered this sanctuary and began hugging each other. Several were in a critical mindset, but are now reported to be feeling optimistic or even ebullient, according to one source. And, according to some, there is only one source. We're working on verifying that claim. But we want to be clear. This transformative experience is believed to be highly contagious. And in what some are calling the ripple effect, it could transform the world as we know it. Stay tuned for more on this developing story. We now resume our normally scheduled service, already in progress. Thank you, Kenna. So I wanted to start that way. It's a little different, right? Different way to start a talk than you've ever heard. But I wanted to illustrate a point, which is the topic of this. There's a lot in the news that people are feeling, and it seemed like a topic that might be worthy of bringing up here. But I wanted to point out that that's not what we hear in the news, is it? And yet, what happens here every Sunday has a greater impact on lives than many of the things we'll hear about in the news, robberies or scandals that are temporary. But what we do here is big news. Now, as I was performing this for you, I tried to capture that classic news tone, which is one of serious absolute authority, a tone developed in the heyday of broadcast journalism and perfected, of course, by the great Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, as he was known. Now, he used to end his newscast every night with a very specific phrase. Do you remember?
Yes.
And that's the way it is. And that's the way it is. It was his final declaration, his amen, if you will. In fact, that saying is the reason that I'm doing this talk. I realized a few weeks back how close that famous phrase was to our way of ending a prayer. And so it is. And that made me ask, what if we looked at the modern news industry, especially broadcast news, like it was a religion? A set of beliefs which has a regular service, delivering its message. Instead of a minister, they have an anchor. The various correspondents help out with the service, and for those who want more, they have an equivalent of a Bible discussion where you watch people talk about the news and debate what it all means. We tithe through fees, cable subscriptions, commercials. It's a worldview with an elaborate infrastructure supporting it. Now let me be clear. Even though his phrase got me thinking, I am not critiquing Walter Cronkite, who admitted that it was a bit much to say something so grand every night, but once he had it out there, it was his thing. Journalists like him and the late Robert McNeil served us well, and I tip my hat to them. What I'm really exploring today is this worldview that we've all been caught in, of modern news as the reality, the way it is. And that worldview, focusing on what's tragic or broken, has moved ever more into our collective consciousness as the news has expanded from 15 minutes a day to 30 minutes, and now all the time everywhere. And there is a spiritual cost to that. In a sense, this is all an outgrowth of the ego, which always focuses on what's wrong or broken. And we can find that very easily when that's what we're looking for. It is, in fact, crucial to look at what's broken. But, starved of spirit, we get no hope, just a world of error, or sin, as we sometimes call it. Unity's third principle tells us, our thoughts create the experience of our lives. 7 in 10 Americans suffer from negative news fatigue. And that negativity is, in fact, affecting how we experience life. So many of us are experiencing fearful lives not because of crime, for example, but because of our thoughts about crime, which it turns out very often are error thoughts. In recent polling by Gallup, when asked about national crime, 63% of respondents assessed crime as extremely or very serious. And that's the highest percentage since they began asking that question in the year 2000. But guess what? A few months ago, in December of 2023, the FBI released a report on crime in America, that revealed a, quote, large, potentially historic decrease in crime nationwide. This was in almost every area of crime, and for that terribly frightening crime of murder, the decrease was, quote, either the largest or one of the largest national declines in murder on record. Which is big news, right? But in the month after the release of this report, the network news spent a total of 3 minutes on it. And cable, not much better. The rest of the time, they mainly focused on scary stories about how dangerous, for example, New York City is. They would focus on each murder, get people really frightened about it. And I've heard people where I live say, I won't go to New York City anymore, it's too dangerous. But what are the facts? In 2019, among the top 100 most populous cities, New York ranked 80th. Meaning there are 79 places that have a higher rate. New York is 80th. That's pretty safe, right? So if crime is going down, if New York is that low on the list, everybody would assume it's number 1. It's number 80. Why do we believe otherwise? Well, think about how affirmations work. If I spend 3 minutes a month affirming the highest truth, and 58 hours saying, I can't trust anyone, life is dangerous, I'm doomed. Guess what I believe? So what are we affirming as a nation, as a world, through the news that we consume? And what is that doing to us? The sheer volume of news overwhelms so many of us, and we can develop what psychologists call learned helplessness. But let's be clear, we are not helpless. We're not powerless observers of the world. In fact, this is the school of practical Christianity. Practical because we seek to put a way of life into practice. We are engaged partners in co-creating the world we inhabit, the one we experience. So ultimately, today's talk is not meant to be a gripe session about the news, but rather a challenge to us to look at what we can do in this environment when we feel overwhelmed by the news, as many of us do each day. How can we be in the world, but not of it? Well, first, I've heard people suggest that we look at the news as a series of prayer requests. All right, well, how would we actually do that? Are there any prayer chaplains here? I've been trained as a prayer chaplain myself. Well, when I hear a news story, I can identify what we call the prayer need. It might be security, divine order, healing, or harmony. The divine prayer need underneath. Then I can articulate that in a prayer, and for extra credit, I can seek to demonstrate that quality in my life, to bring it into the world right where I am. Harmony, peace, healing, divine order. Second, we can be conscious of the quantity and quality of news we're taking in, of our news diet. How much am I ingesting? And am I mainly getting sensationalism and clickbait, sort of the junk food of modern news? Or am I getting something more nutritious? I can become conscious of the overall amount of news I take in and look for healthier choices. For me, that means a slower pace, less of the dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. less breaking news, and more conversation, as well as segments on the arts and other areas of life. There's even something now called solutions-based journalism, which I discovered in preparing this talk. Quite helpful. Look it up, solutions-based journalism, whole philosophy. So, what are your enlivening news sources? Some other tips that I've come up with. At any moment we can ask ourselves, how can I balance this? So when I watch a news story on YouTube, I can then watch a little 5-minute Eckhart Tolle video. Right? I can choose something else to balance, to reestablish that. At any moment I can ask, right now, is my heart expanding or contracting? Just becoming aware of that has a huge impact. And perhaps most importantly, do I have access to something right now that transcends this? Remember in John 16:22, Jesus says, "In the world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." In unity, we believe that he's speaking from his Christ essence, which lies often dormant in us. That's Christ in us, which we have individually and collectively, as Paul emphasizes. Paul also says in Romans 12:2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." How unity is that? So do I have access to that which transcends the world we see around us, or that the news shows us? And if not, how can I practice connecting with it so that even when the news is breaking, I am restored? And crucially, at any moment, especially after taking in the news, I can ask, what is my worldview right now? Not their worldview, my worldview. I can take responsibility for that. In The Universal Christ, Richard Rohr says, "Your worldview is not what you look at. It is what you look out from or look through. It is thus taken for granted, largely unconscious, and in great part it determines what you see and what you don't see at all." Now he identifies 4 major worldviews that we move between, and I'd like to summarize them as I found them very helpful. Number 1, the worldview he calls the material worldview. That says the outer visible world is all that's real. That worldview has, in fact, produced science, medicine, and many of the comforts of modern civilization. But he says it, quote, tends to create highly consumer-oriented and competitive cultures, which are often preoccupied with scarcity, since material goods are always limited. The second worldview he calls the spiritual worldview, which says that the inner, spiritual, invisible world is all that is truly real. Kind of the opposite of the material view, acknowledging the spiritual world, but when taken too far, it, quote, has little concern for the earth, the neighbor, or justice, because it considers the world largely an illusion. 3, what he calls the priestly worldview, you could call the religious worldview, which wants to bring spirit and matter together and provide mediators toward that end. He says this includes many gurus, ministers, therapists, and sacred communities, but it assumes the two worlds are separate and that helpers are needed to bring them back together. It can lead to what he calls religious consumerism or even religious codependency, more than seeking. And then the fourth one, the one that he loves, the incarnational worldview, in which we understand that matter and spirit were never separate. He says, quote, this view relies more on awakening than joining, more on seeing than obeying, more on growth in consciousness and love than on clergy, experts, morality, scriptures, or rituals. The code word I am using in this entire book for this worldview is simply Christ. Again, Richard Rohr in The Universal Christ. He says this cannot be glibly accepted with phrases like, it's all God. It actually has to be realized and embodied at a deep level, and this takes time and commitment and practice. But those who truly live in this worldview can feel as holy in a rowdy bar as in a quiet chapel, and can see the Christ in everyone, truly not just as an idea, but as a living reality. And to me, that sounds like practical Christianity. It's the incarnation of Spirit, the Word becoming flesh, bringing God here, bringing Christ into the world through and as us. So, what worldview am I in truly at any time, and how might I move toward the one I'd prefer? So that eventually, perhaps, that becomes my unconscious lens. Since it's by far the dominant model, I'm apt to be stuck most often in the material worldview as I seek to deal with life's issues and worldly challenges. And that's where the news resides, almost always, the material. When I catch myself there in an unhelpful way, when I feel my inner energy contracting, how can I move toward that place of embodied connection? What helps me to experience life as the play of forms, as Eckhart Tolle puts it? So that whatever I'm doing, from paying bills to visiting the dentist to grocery shopping, all of that is actually secondary. My primary reality is the incarnation of Spirit, of presence. Some of the tips I've mentioned today hopefully can help, as well as prayer and meditation, of course, and coming here. And look at what we do with the music, the way we embody Spirit. That's what I'm talking about. It's done here. For me, the most immediately helpful practice in any moment is gratitude. Can I spend time paying attention to what I'm grateful for? Not taking it for granted, but giving it my focus. Allowing it to permeate into my being and remind me of the truth with a capital T. We don't need to deny or indulge or distract away from the news. We can incorporate healthy versions of it into our larger worldview, to include and also transcend it with something we know from experience is bigger. It's like they say, don't tell God how big your problems are. Tell your problems how big your God is. From this mindset, the incarnated world in all its messy complexity is, in fact, beautiful. And that's the way it is. June 2nd, 2024, and always.